Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I want to welcome you to this course. I know that this is the first time we are interacting, and certainly there are a number of things that we may have to discuss and agree on. I know that previously we've had some interactions, especially over Zoom. And we did introduce ourselves to each other. So in this session, it's not necessary for us to introduce each other because we have done that already. I know that we have some new members who are just joining us. But all the same, I think we shall be interacting and introducing ourselves along the way. Now, if you recall, the program that you are pursuing is a program in environmental health and safety. Now, the course that I will be facilitating is philosophy and leadership of occupational health and safety. Now we want to start our lecture, and today we are going to handle the first topic. And our first topic is on the overview of environmental health and ethical theories of environmental health and safety. We cannot go into the course of occupational health and safety without understanding what environmental health is all about and the various ethical theories that guide our understanding, theorization, conceptualization of occupational health and safety. Now, in this session, we are going to cover three main aspects. One, we are going to define environmental health. What is environmental health? We need to understand this animal called environmental health. Two, we shall look at a brief history of environmental health. Where are we coming from? And where have we reached? And what are those developments that may guide the understanding of this area in future? And then three, we shall be discussing ethical theory of environmental health and safety. And under the ethical theories, we shall certainly introduce the concept of ethics. We shall be able to look at ethics and the environment. What are those perspectives of ethics and the environment? Then we shall also delve into the value of human health. Remember, this course is on the philosophy and leadership of occupational health and safety. Therefore, we have to go into the value of human health. And then later on, our lecture, as we move towards the end, will go into principle-based method for ethical decision-making, and then thereafter I will summarize and conclude the course. Right, so I hope you've got me right, and those are the three major aspects: environmental health, a brief history of environmental health, and the ethical theory of environmental health and safety. Right, we can now start trying to understand this subject that is before us, and that is environmental health. What is it? Now, I know that environmental health has been defined differently, different ways by different scholars. In fact, there are so many definitions of environmental health as there are scholars on the subject. Now, for purposes of appreciating this course and understanding exactly what we are covering, I'll give you what some scholars think. Now, some scholars describe environmental health as a scientific field of study similar to biology or chemistry. And I know that some of you have been exposed to natural sciences, and that's why you are environmental officers wherever you are. So, the definition has taken on a natural science perspective, scientific field of study similar to biology or chemistry. Now, there are other scholars who have a different view altogether. Now, those other scholars think that this environmental health is an applied discipline similar to medicine, public health. I'm sure you get where we are coming from and where we are getting. So, the second group of scholars think it's an applied discipline, similar to medicine or public health. Now, of course, others believe that there must be a combination of the natural science aspect and the application. Now, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences defines environmental health as an important area which looks at the scientific aspects of the environment and attempts to understand the complex relationship between environmental risk factors and human biology within the affected population and individuals in a particular community. That is their perspective. Now, they also look at this environmental health as an applied discipline that uses knowledge to prevent illness, that uses knowledge to reduce disease, that uses knowledge to promote health. And that is what National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences says. So, this is what it is. But it's very important for you, again, to recognize the fact that many different scientific disciplines have attempted to develop knowledge related to environmental health and attempting to implement policies and practices and procedures that promote environmental health. I'll just give you an example. For instance, in the scientific discipline of ecology, there is an applied aspect of environmental health that deals with solid and hazardous waste management. And that's ecology, a scientific discipline. Now we have others like toxicology, and that is a scientific discipline. Now toxicology has the other applied discipline perspective, and that is hydrology and water management. Now again, if you go to exposure biology, you'll find occupational health and industrial hygiene as an applied discipline. In epidemiology, you'll have public health. And in environmental medicine, you'll have urban planning. And of course, genetics and genomics, you have civil engineering. And cellular and reproductive biology, you have environmental engineering. And endocrinology, you have environmental consulting. And neurology, you will have, of course, agriculture. And of course, meteorology and climatology, you'll have forestry management as an applied discipline. Now, of course, again, in scientific discipline of environmental economics, you have environmental law and ethics addressing those specific aspects of environmental health. So, that is how knowledge is developing over time, and a lot of research and many other new things are being discovered over time. So, ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand this concept of environmental health very well, and the disciplines that have contributed towards that discipline, of course, in the science area and the applied area, because it has the science aspect, because some scholars think that it has that natural element like biology and chemistry, while others say it has the applied component of it. Now, in order to clarify the definition of environmental health, it is important to distinguish between different environmental risk factors. Now, I'll give an example. For example, biological factors. These include the various organisms and species in our environment, such as bacteria, fungi, food crops, trees, birds, insects, cattle, and rodents. And these are part of the biological factors and the organisms and species which are present in our environment do affect human beings. And they bring our attention to that aspect of environmental health. Now, of course, we also have the larger units of biological organization. And these larger units of biological organizations will include ecological communities, the ecosystems, and the biosphere. And all these are quite important. Now, remember, the definition has the natural science perspective and the applied. Now, it also makes us start thinking and considering a number of aspects that make sense in environmental health. And these include the chemical factors. And the chemical factors, for instance, will include things like water, oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, phosphates, pesticides, etc., industrial waste, heavy metals. All these things are part of the chemical factors. Now, the physical factors include the physical aspects of our environment, and they are part of the definition. And these are, they include things like geology, they include weather, they include gravity, they include things like heat, electromagnetic radiations, etc. So these are physical. Now, we also have what we call social factors, and the social factors include characteristics of human societies that can affect health. And these are, for instance, well, they can include warfare, racism, poverty, religion. All these can affect our health. Buildings, infrastructure, social institutions, occupations. I mean, the list is quite long, and I may not be able to really articulate all these things. But our major objective is to try and understand the concept of environmental health, constituted by the social factors that I've just given you, the physical factors, the chemical factors, and of course, those are all what we call environmental risk aspects. They all constitute environmental risk components. Right, so having said that, ladies and gentlemen, we discover that although this definition of environmental health is a little bit broad, including these aspects that I've already said, it is prudent to focus our attention, our inquiries, our conceptualizations, and research on environmental factors that we are able to control or mitigate. So in environmental health, we focus our attention on things that we can be able to control or mitigate. For example, we have no control of the amount of type, the amount or type of solar radiation that reaches the Earth from the sun. However, we have an ability to affect the protective ozone layer in the atmosphere, which blocks harmful ultraviolet radiations. So we may talk about the sun, right? And we know what the sun does, right? But we limit our attention, especially when we start talking about environmental health. We focus our attention to the things that we have control of, and here we have control over the amount, or what we call the type of solar radiation that reaches the Earth through the control of the ozone layer. Now, I want to remind you that in the 1970s, for instance, scientists discovered a variety of compounds, such as the chlorofluorocarbons. I hope you still remember the CFCs. Now, these ones, the chlorofluorocarbons, cause ozone depletion. They cause the depletion of the ozone layer when released into the atmosphere. And of course, once that happens, we start realizing the dangers of the ozone depletion. And we don't want that layer to be depleted. Of course, I know there is a debate, especially among the scientists and the politicians, right? And today, some politicians actually disagree with some of those things, and that's why they have decided to do whatever they are doing in their own countries. So the depletion of this ozone layer is very, very important for us to understand, and that's why a number of international agreements and treaties were signed for countries to be members of this, because the ozone layer, of course, is spread throughout the entire Earth, and nobody has monopoly over the ozone layer, right? And we are all affected in the same way, whether you are in South Africa, or you are in Uganda, or you are in the UK or America. Certainly the impact and the depletion of the ozone layer will have far-reaching consequences on your health as an individual. So we recognize here that while the study of the sun's energy production should be left to the astrophysicists, environmental scientists can study the formation of the ozone layer. The environmental scientists can study how different compounds affect it. They can also study how the ozone layer depletion can cause disease such as skin cancer. And that is the responsibility of environmental scientists. Now, focusing on aspects of environment that can control or mitigate does not mean that we should take an apathetic attitude toward the environment. We shouldn't take the stoic attitude towards the environment. Although we are saying that we should focus on the things that we have control over, the things that we can manage, or things where we can take certain measures. This does not in any way imply that we should take a relaxed mood and a relaxed position and a no-care attitude about the environment, and simply sit back and say, well, we should accept whatever fate may befall us. No, that's not what we are saying. We have the ability to affect. We have the ability to respond to the environmental changes with the advances in science and technology. For example, at one time, it was not possible to accurately predict natural disasters. I hope you still remember that time. We could not accurately predict that we shall have tornadoes. We could not accurately predict that we shall have hurricanes. But with the advances in science and technology, we can accurately predict that we shall have tornadoes, hurricanes, tsunamis, floods, and volcanoes. Advances in meteorology, for instance, advances in geology, advances in oceanography, for example, have made it possible to forecast, have made it possible to prepare for, and have made it possible to respond to natural disasters. Advances in engineering, for instance, advances in architecture, advances in building construction, for instance, and other sciences have allowed us to create structures that are able to withstand high winds, earthquakes, and floods. So, as environmental scientists, you should not sit somewhere and relax and say, well, we have nothing that we can do about the environment. There is something that we can do. Do not forget, my course is Philosophy and Leadership of Occupational Health, but I wanted to give you that background and demonstrate how occupational health and safety is part or forms part of environmental health, which is a broader area. Environmental health is broad, while occupational health and safety is specific to the various organizations or institutions. I know you can talk about organizational, right, in terms of occupational, and external environmental health in terms of public health. But in our case here, we are really concerned with occupational health that must fit in what we call environmental health. Because the two are related, organizations interact with the environment. And these organizations and companies do create problems for humanity at the end of the day. And unless they understand that their actions in certain environments have implications for the wide environment, then we may not be able to achieve much. So I've demonstrated to you that we shouldn't sit back, because advances in science, wherever you are, engineering, architecture, right, meteorology, geology, etc., has made it possible for us to predict with accuracy, and of course try to come up with systems, structures, which can withstand some of these terrible and unpredictable, catastrophic events that befall us in our lives. So it's very important, and that's what we are saying. Maybe one day we may even be able to prevent things like asteroids or comets from causing cataclysmic destruction to human civilization and the entire biosphere. So with science, so many things are being experimented, research is going on, and many things will be done. Right. Now, although we are discussing issues related to environmental health, there are certain things that we can't avoid. Disciplines like politics, disciplines like economics, and so forth, do come in at one stage or the other. But our responsibility as environmental health scientists is to really avoid over-politicizing environmental health, although there is a political implication to it. So we realize that political, economic, and moral values often influence decision-making related to the science of environmental health, and we know that very well. Let me just try to articulate some of these things in brief. For example, politics often comes into play when the government is deciding how to allocate public funding for science projects. So you can't avoid the element of politics there. It's important because at the end of the day, during the budgeting process, money will be allocated to various sectors and various activities within the national economy. So if a government agency, for instance, decides to increase the amount of funding for research on climate change, then it has made a decision that this research is politically or morally important. When they do not budget for it, it means they are saying it is not politically and morally important. When some of the presidents decided to pull out from some of the treaties on climate change, they were actually telling you that this climate change treaty is not politically and morally important. And therefore, that is how the component of politics comes in. It's very important. Now, again, as I've already said, economic interests have a direct bearing on funding decisions made by private companies. We know that very well. We've got private companies that actually sponsor research in certain areas. Unfortunately, in developing countries, very few private companies sponsor scientists and researchers to examine certain things. And this is really very funny. And that's why our economies are not even growing and advancing in the way they should be advancing. So, but let me just give you an example of where a company can sponsor researchers into certain areas by allocating funds for that. Now, if, for example, a pesticide company decides to sponsor research on the safety of one of its products, then it has made this decision because it believes the research that you are going to undertake as a scientist will contribute to the company's profit margin. When companies fail to sponsor, when companies fail to budget for research in certain areas, they are simply telling us as companies that these areas are not economically and morally important to the organizations, and they cannot add an economic margin to the operations. And that is really unfortunate. So, at its core, ladies and gentlemen, environmental health is a scientific discipline. There is no way we can avoid that. At its core, it's a scientific discipline. 2, it is also an applied practice that seeks to promote health and prevent disease. And these are 2 things that we need to think about, right? 1, it is a science. 2, it is an applied practice. Right. At this material time, then we can raise a question or a number of questions if you bother to do so. So, questions about the role of human values and environmental health are important and cannot be ignored. We need to examine, we need to interrogate the role of human values. I know we have said it is a science. 2, we have also said it's an applied practice. But the moment you bring in the application bit of it, you cannot leave out human beings in the equation. And you cannot leave out institutions that have been created by human beings to create wealth. And this is only possible because entrepreneurs, or those specific and special human beings, had certain values. They had missions, they had visions that they wanted to achieve on this planet Earth. So that's why we bring in questions about the role of human values in environmental health, because they are important. They are important in understanding what we mean by health, a concept of health. Right. Now, the World Health Organization has attempted to define health. World Health Organization has defined health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. That is the definition. Now, while this definition has some intuitive appeal, it has been criticized by scholars, by politicians, by various individuals as being too broad. Why have they criticized it? They think it is too broad, and it includes more than absence of disease, and also complete social well-being. And that's where their contention is. So, taken literally, this implies, from the World Health Organization definition, it implies that health includes many different factors essential to social well-being. And these include a living wage, for instance. You can imagine. So when you talk about health, you can't ignore that element of well-being, right? So the World Health Organization report has given us that definition, which is broad, and in that definition we can actually bring in so many aspects, including a living wage. We can talk about education, for instance. We can talk about community. We can talk about happiness. We can talk about freedom from discrimination or political and religious persecution. And the element of health, as seen by World Health Organization, takes us to the understanding that all forms of persecution, whether political or religious, cannot promote health. They can only promote ill health. So, such a broad definition given by World Health Organization attempts to medicalize social and political problems. And this would entail that environmental health should be concerned with things like human rights, should be concerned with poverty, should be concerned with warfare, should be concerned with discrimination, justice, and so forth. And that's why some people actually have put up a spirited fight against that definition of health as provided for by World Health Organization. The World Health Organization definition would overly politicize mental health and obligate environmental health researchers and practitioners to tackle social and political problems well beyond their domain of expertise. And that's why we need to rethink whereas that's the definition that has been given by World Health Organization, what should we do as environmental scientists? How should we conceptualize environmental health? Now, I'll tell you that Boss, one of the scholars, in 1977, attempted to develop a narrower and a more focused and scientific definition of health. And according to Boss, certainly, a healthy organism is one that functions normally, and a disease is deviation from normal functioning. So according to Boss, he looks at health in terms of functioning normally. So if you're talking about the health of an individual, that individual should function normally. And therefore, when you talk about occupational health, you are looking at an individual functioning normally at his place of work. Let me take you to a brief history of environmental health, and this will be brief, certainly. Now, I'll tell you that human beings have recognized the relationship between environmental factors and health and disease throughout human history. In fact, over the years, these are issues that human beings have been grappling with. For example, ancient people knew the importance of having access to clean water, and that is part of environmental health. There is evidence that the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, Indians, and of course, other individuals throughout the world in various civilizations had water and sewer systems. For example, the Greeks had sewer systems. Egyptians had sewer systems. The Romans built extensive systems of pipes, aqueducts, if you remember, pumps, fountains. And that happened way back. Ancient people also understood the importance of preserving food and not eating spoiled food. The Jewish thinking, the Jewish prohibition on eating pork, for instance, came from the recognition that eating this type of meat can cause disease. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now looking at the historical development in brief. Let me tell you that during the Black Death, this was an outbreak of the bubonic plague that decimated European populations around 1300. People thought that something in the environment was causing the disease, and that's environmental health. But they didn't understand. They never had that proper and good understanding of the source. The plague, that bubonic plague, was carried by fleas on rats. But many Europeans mistakenly thought that the plague was carried by cats, which they regarded as agents of the devil. So in the process, they started killing cats. And this is very funny. When they killed, remember the cats actually eat the rats, and the rats actually carried the fleas, and the fleas carried that plague. So when they killed the cats, the rats, the population of the rats actually increased because of the the rate at which they were multiplying. And the rate of infection of fleas also went up, and therefore there was disaster around that time. But later on, for those who had not killed the cats, right, they survived. And that's how they came to actually understand that the problem was not the cat or the cats, which they consider to be agents of the devil, but it was something totally different. And that's what it is. So that's what it is. So environmental health as a scientific study began around the 1700s. And this was prompted by the growing recognition of the health problems associated with the rapidly growing cities, such as air pollution and coal burning factories, horse manure and sewage. Of course, today, you've got some leaders who have decided to go back to the use of coal burning as a source of energy. So you now have coal burning factories in the US, for instance, China. Of course, US had reduced, right, these numbers. But given the current developments in the world politics, the present leader of the US said, no, let us have these things there. And therefore, right now, you've got another position altogether. And that's why I have been talking about the political aspects, the economic aspects coming in to influence environmental health decisions. So I'm now giving you the historical development. The scientific studies about environmental health start around the 1700. Around 1300, of course, there were concerns which came from the spread of the bubonic plague, which killed many Europeans. But now around 1700, you have that scientific approach to try and understand environmental health. Now, I also know that epidemiology started to emerge as a scientific discipline in the 17th and 18th centuries. So epidemiology came up and emerged as a scientific discipline when researchers, like, for instance, John Gout, who lived between 1620 and 1674. We have another scholar, William Farr, who lived between 1807 to 1883. And we have another scholar, Edwin Chodwick, between 1800 and 1890. These three scholars did a great job when they compiled a report. They compiled and analyzed data relating to health, and they published a report, which report was used as a masterpiece to try and understand environmental health. Now, taking you to another period, and I hope you remember that period that's the Industrial Revolution. There were also serious concerns around that time. So during the Industrial Revolution, working conditions in factories, working conditions in mines, working conditions in mills produced many occupational fatalities and injuries. For example, in England alone, Charles Turner Thackray, that is in 1795 and 1833, published a book that brought the attention of the public that there were work-related hazards in industries and factories and mills. And this led to the passage of the Factory Act in 1833 and the Mines Act in 1842. And for some of you who have listened to, and actually read, not only listened, but also reading, the novel, of course, I know there are plays, but the novels that were written by Charles Dickens. I can give you an example of Oliver Twist, written around 1838. Now, this writing of Oliver Twist called attention to the plight of the urban poor and the social conditions that they faced. In the United States, Alice Hamilton made important contributions to occupational health. And he attempted to document the link between toxic exposures and illnesses among factory workers and miners. And through her service as the director of Illness Occupational Disease Commission, he dedicated that time to bring to the fore many of the things that were not known by the public that are occupational health related. Now, there are so many others, and I think you allow me to skip those things. I think you can always go and find out what those things are. But let me just bring you to the more or less very close to where we are now. In 1915, between 1915 and 1992, having Selikov, I'm sure you've read his contribution. He demonstrated that workers exposed to asbestos, right? Those specific individuals exposed to asbestos developed various types of lung diseases, including cancer. And that was the works of Selikov. We also know that Herbert Needleman, and this is a pediatrician and a child psychologist at the University of Pittsburgh, he conducted research in the 1970s and the 1980s. It's as recent as that, and demonstrated the detrimental effects of lead on cognitive development. And actually, his work supported bans on lead in gasoline and interior paints, as well as efforts to remove lead paint from other homes. So that was the work of Herbert Needleman, who discovered that this compound called lead is very dangerous to children, and it causes impairment, cognitive impairment. So the development of the mind of the individual is impaired by that. And this led to the banning of lead in paint, various homes, in gasoline, and all over the place. So since the 1970s, environmental health has expanded beyond its traditional concerns with occupational health, and that's what we are talking about. Exposure to hazardous substance, hygiene to address socioeconomic factors that influence health, and of course the global concerns that we are talking about here. So that's what it is. In 1983, of course, United Nations gave us its position on environmental issues. Right, so I think that brief history is enough, and you'll go and read on the internet. There's a lot of material that is scattered all over the place. You can always assemble, and you know the position as to where we are and where we are going. Let me now turn to the last part of our presentation or lecture, and that is really ethics, or ethical theory of environmental health and safety. Now, for us to understand ethical theories or ethical issues in environmental health, it is important to have a good grasp of environmental health and ethics. So we need to understand ethics, and I'm going to give you that background. So what is ethics then? Ethics can be defined as a set of standards, a set of norms for distinguishing right from wrong, right actions from wrong actions, or trying to understand the standards of ethics. So when we talk about ethics, we are dealing with moral rights and moral wrongs. We attempt to understand the standards that communities and societies that have put in place to distinguish between rights and wrong actions. And that is a simple definition of ethics. So, moral concepts or ethical concepts include such notions as obligation of duty, for instance, issues of virtue, issues of justice, issues of rights, issues of happiness, issues of value, issues of goodness. All these are ethical concepts, and we need to understand them. So the study of ethics can be divided into 4 different fields or 4 different areas. The first one is what we call normative ethics, ladies and gentlemen. Now, normative ethics examines general concepts and principles of ethics. Normative, general concepts and principles of ethics. The second area is applied ethics. Now, this applied ethics investigates ethical decision-making in particular domains, such as medicine, science, law, or environmental studies. That's why it's called applied ethics. So you'll be talking about accounting ethics, marketing ethics, procurement ethics, medicine ethics or medical ethics, environmental ethics, but even environment is very broad. You can go into specific areas of the environment and come up with what we call ethics related to that particular aspect. And that is applied ethics. Then the third is what we call meta-ethics. Meta-ethics. Now this one analyzes the meaning and the justification of ethical concepts and principles. So we examine the meaning and we try to justify the meanings of those concepts and principles. And for some of you who have been exposed to philosophy, for instance, especially philosophy of knowledge, you know that knowledge is justified true beliefs. Now, if you are talking about justified true beliefs, right, there's that element of justification. So in meta-ethics, we attempt to understand, first of all, develop meaning and understand those particular meanings which relate to the concepts which are developed in ethics. Now, lastly, that's the fourth one, is empirical ethics. So this one studies moral reasoning, judgment, behavior, learning, and development. And as you can see, empirical, at the end of the day, you go into these things. Why do people do certain things in the way they do them? So you attempt to understand these things. Now, for many years, ladies and gentlemen, ethics has been predominantly the domain of humanistic disciplines, right, such as philosophy, theology, and so forth. But right now, as I speak, empirical disciplines study ethics. Now, you talk about ethics in psychology, talk about ethics in sociology, ethics in anthropology, ethics in economics, ethics in social biology, and so forth. And of course, ethics in law. All these are things that you'll find quite interesting when you get onto the internet and start studying and reading the material that's available on the internet. Now, there is a link between law and ethics, and I think I should talk about this because there's confusion almost everywhere. Whenever you talk about ethics, some people think about laws. And when you talk about laws, some people think about ethics. Now, the two disciplines are not the same, they are different. But I can assure you, ethics has much in common with law, but the two are different. Let me demonstrate to you how ethics and law are similar. Ethics and law are similar in that they both provide guidance for human conduct. Ethics provides guidance for human conduct, and law provides guidance for human conduct. Now, the two, law and ethics deal with similar concepts, such as obligation, concepts like duty, concepts like rights. We talk about these in ethics. When we start talking about the Kantian ethic of duty, we'll be talking about rights and duties. When we start talking about justice, Raoul's justice, and Raoul is a significant contributor to the discipline of law. And I'm sure you are aware about that. Now, in the area of ethics, you find also Raoul as a scholar being cited. So that's why you have now that overlap between the two. Now, both law and ethics use the Socratic method, which involves consideration and analysis of opposing views. The questioning approach is important in ethics and important in law. We question and we start building up the case for and the case against, and of course using available evidence to prove our case beyond reasonable doubt. In ethics, you may not be able to prove the case beyond reasonable doubt, but issues of morals and values are important. And there's no way you can develop a law without taking into consideration the needs of the various individuals. But anyway, the two do have that component of confluence, and they are also different. So, law and ethics are also different. They differ. These disciplines are different in important ways. And let me give you 2 points to prove the difference. One, laws are backed by a coercive power of the state. Yes, because at the end of the day, the state must be behind the laws that have been developed. For instance, if you break the law, you can face a financial penalty, you can face imprisonment, or in some countries, you can face capital punishment. That is on the side of the law. Now, I know that some ethical standards, such as prohibitions against murder, right? Because in the area of ethics, for instance, you will not promote murder. But again, remember, these things are very controversial, very, very controversial, depending on the ethical theory or ethical theories that you ascribe to. Let me just give you an example. We are aware of the divine command theory. Now, divine command theory is based on the understanding that whatever is morally right depends on the will of God. And that's the divine command theory. And therefore, the ethical rule book of communities and societies will depend on the kind of religion they ascribe to. For instance, an evangelical Christian, the ethical rule book will be the Bible. For a Muslim, the ethical rule book will be a Quran. I know that others have their own books, but that's what it is. Now let me tell you, whereas the concept I was talking about was an issue of murder, now if you read these books very well, according to the divine command theory, you discover that there are instances where God commanded certain individuals to go and kill and utterly destroy. I'll give you an example. 1 Samuel 15, in the Bible, God gave that command. Go and utterly destroy the Amalekites, and do not spare any. But of course, what the other gentleman did was totally different. But I'll not go into the details of that, but just to demonstrate to you that was killing. And some scholars have raised questions about ethics, and they're saying, was that ethical? But I'll tell you, if you are guided by the ethical rule book and you are using the divine command theory, that will be morally right, because that is the will of God. Now, of course, there are various scholars that have come up to explain, a scholar like Kaggad, Soren, and the rest of them, and some of them believe that no, there are no contradictions about these things. But anyway, we're just giving a distinction and similarity between ethics and the law. So in terms of distinguishing the two, we are saying laws are backed by a coercive power of the state, and if you do something, you will be imprisoned, and you may also suffer from capital punishment. Second, we can appeal to ethical standards to criticize, protest, and defend the laws. So some of the laws that have been developed have been defended by simply appealing to ethical standards. And you can also criticize, and you can appeal, and you can dismiss some of these things. For example, during the civil rights movement in the United States, many people argued that laws requiring racial segregation were unethical. And many people protested those laws through civil disobedience. You all know what happened in South Africa with the apartheid regime. They also protested against apartheid. So, ethics is also similar to, but different to ethics. And I've given you the distinction between the two. Let me now turn to ethics and politics. So, ethics and politics are also similar and different. So, how are they similar? Ethics and politics are similar in the sense that they provide guidance for human conduct via the development of rules and standards. When you talk about ethics, you are talking about ethics of a particular community or society, so that means that community or society has come up with rules, values that must be followed by every individual. And at the end of the day, you can base on those values and rules to develop a law. And we know that laws and ethics use similar concepts such as rights and justice. So these two domains focus on different levels of analysis, but at the end of the day, they have a point of confluence. The two actually do meet. Right, so ethics on the micro level asks questions like, what should I do? Right, and that is now the aspect of ethics referring to an individual. Now, politics relates to the entire society or community or country in this case. You can talk about Ugandan politics, Kenyan politics, South African politics, United States politics, etc. So ethics focuses at the micro level and asks questions like, what should I do as an individual? How should I make decisions as an individual? While politics focuses on the macro level, and politics will ask questions like, what should we do as a society? And how should we make decisions as a society? So that is what it is. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to also compare ethics and religion. Some people have a feeling that ethics is religion and religion is ethics. No, the two are totally different. Ethics, we talk about moral rights and wrongs of a particular community or individual or society. That is at that level, right? But when you go to religion, you start looking at beliefs of individuals. Right, so ethics is similar to, but also different from religion. So, how are they similar? They are similar because ethics and religion do provide standards of conduct. Religion will give you standards of conduct, and ethics does. They also focus on similar concepts such as obligation, duty, justice, and virtue. But ethics and religion are different, right? Different as well, in the sense that ethical rules and standards like prohibition against murder, rape, theft, and dishonest are not perceived in exactly the same way. So there are differences in the perceptions on aspects that give us ethical rules and standards, like prohibition of murder, rape, for example, theft and dishonesty. I'll tell you something interesting. If somebody steals today, right, and he goes to a priest, you don't even have to go to a priest, but that fellow kneels in the corner somewhere, according to religion, that is perfect or right. If you are an evangelical, this person has repented. That's what it is. Right. In the Catholic Church, you go to a priest, you tell him whatever you've done, and you say, well, I forgive you. And you will also feel somehow a little bit secure. And that's religion. But according to ethics, that will be morally wrong. It's morally wrong for you to steal. And that will be written down as something that is terrible. That's what it is. So, even though ethics and religion are distinct domains, we also see overlaps every now and then, depending on the ethical theory. If you're using the divine command theory, where the ethical rule book is the Bible, so you'll find that religion and the ethics overlap. However, if you use the Kantian ethic of duty, the situation is totally different. If you're using the utilitarian theory, the position is different. Right. If you're using other stages of moral development given by Kohlberg's stages of moral development, still the perception will be totally different and the approach will be totally different. So religion and ethics will be considered as two different disciplines, certainly. Right, let's look at ethics and the environment. Because we remember, your program is environmental health. The course is geared towards the philosophy and leadership of occupational health. So, but what's the link between ethics and the environment? Now, environmental ethics emerged as a distinct discipline in the 1970s. Of course, the people who were behind this were the philosophers, the theologians, the attorneys, the scientists, political activists, etc. All these people raised awareness about environmental issues. And the issues that we're talking about were pollution, species preservation, urban development issues. So the politicians, the theologians, and the rest of them thought that these are major aspects that must be discussed. And many argued that traditional ethical theories did not have the conceptual tools to adequately deal with environmental problems. And that's how this issue of environmental health actually comes about. And even up to today, there are arguments about environmental, what theories should we use in environmental health? So, and even occupational health, well, of course, occupational health, we can use the traditional theories, but environmental health, we've got questions there. So, many scholars argued around that time that those ethical theories that did exist around that time lacked the conceptual tools to adequately deal with this problem of environmental health and environmental problems. Right. And they argued that those theories, you can actually name the divine command theory, the universal, the Kantian ethic of duty, utilitarian ethic of duties, the virtue ethics, etc. So they thought that all those theories that existed around that time were human-centered. And human-centered here means anthropocentric. So the scholars argued that those theories which are anthropocentric cannot provide the conceptual tools to adequately handle environmental problems which are being faced by society and community at the time. So they thought that those theories did not give adequate consideration to the value of other organisms, the non-human species, the ecosystems, and the biosphere. So they looked through the various theories, they examined them, they interrogated them, and to their amazement, none of them would answer those problems which are facing humanity. They are environmental related. So issues of non-human species, issues of the ecosystem and the biosphere being destroyed, did not have any theory to try and explain that. So, of course, we know very well that the traditional theories had attempted to discuss and develop and conceptualize the value of human happiness, the value of dignity, the value of rights and justice, to try and understand what was happening to individuals. So they were human-centered, taking the individual as the ultimate being that must be preserved without thinking about the environment that was being destroyed during that time. So those theories did not explicitly mention the value of the environment or the obligation, our obligation towards the environment. So a number of scholars came up and pushed for the development of theories that can explain the environment. So they came up with two major questions. They posed two central questions in environmental ethics. And these questions were, one, do we have moral obligations to other forms of life? Other than we respecting one another, how about other forms of life? Right? You are talking about animals. You are talking about the forests. You are talking about the other things that we see out there, the biosphere and so forth. Do we have moral obligations about those things? Now, the second question was, if we have such obligations, what are they? Can we try to understand those moral obligations? Now, in an attempt to answer those two major questions, many philosophers, many theologians, many ethicists have considered that non-human biological systems, such as animals, plants, the ecosystem, etc., have intrinsic value, and therefore we need to pay attention to that area. So here, a value is something that one regards as worth having, something that an individual would regard as pursuing, something that would regard as protecting, the way you would protect health, the way you protect justice, the way you protect virtue and utility. If something has intrinsic value, then it is valuable for its own sake and merits special moral treatment. For example, laws against murder reflect the widespread conviction that human life is intrinsically valuable. Now, taking human life is not a trivial matter and requires extraordinary justification, such as self-defense. If you kill somebody, you really must defend. You must go to courts of law and provide your position. And when you are proven guilty, of course, you will serve a sentence. But for you to be let go, you must tell court that this happened in self-defense. So if something has only instrumental value, what we call extrinsic value, we don't seem to pay attention to it. So that's why we think that the environment has extrinsic, not intrinsic value. So, for example, let me just give you an example. A rock. I believe a rock has extrinsic value, just like you do also think it has extrinsic value. But of course, these fellows who are pushing for the protection and for the ethics of the environment, they are saying, no, those rocks also have intrinsic values. You don't really have them for a sake, but there is also something intrinsic in them. So, if I believe that an ordinary rock has no intrinsic value, I do not need any special moral justification to crush a rock. I don't. So, as you see here, many things have intrinsic value, while others have extrinsic value. Right. So, let's now start thinking about these theories and how the theories can be applied to the things that we are talking about, issues of value, right? So, you'll discover that all the theories that we know, the moral theories, right, they only defend human beings. For example, the divine command theory, I've already told you what it is. The Kantian ethic of duty, of course, which promotes moral agency, happiness in terms of utilitarian, and virtue in virtue ethics, etc., do promote those things. And those are anthropocentric theories, because they attempt to promote happiness of an individual, or what you call goodwill or virtue, because of the intrinsic moral value that we possess, right? So, for extrinsic, you don't need any justification, but intrinsic, I said you need justification. Let me give an example as I move towards the end, certainly, because we should be able to rest in the next few minutes. I know that if you go to the Bible, for instance, the creation story in the Bible's book of Genesis can be interpreted as endorsing anthropocentrism. I'm sure you know that very well, because in that book, the book of Genesis in the Bible says that man is created in the image of God. And the same Bible says man has been granted dominion over the fish, over the birds, and over the animals. So if that is the case, it means that man has the authority and power to do whatever he wants to do with the environment. And some scholars have come up to argue and say, possibly what we know in the Bible that promotes anthropocentrism needs to be challenged. So, until the modern environment movement emerged around the 1960s, anthropocentrism was widely assumed to be the correct view of the relationship between man and nature. And of course, you know, according to divine command theory, you know what Genesis says. God told man, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue the earth. And that was his responsibility. So that means that man could alter a number of things in the Garden of Eden. Now, that was the position. Of course, man lost that position when he sinned, and he was driven out of the presence of God. Now, the anthropocentric aspect promoted by the Bible has been challenged by some scholars. So, the non-anthropocentrism emerged in response to critiques of anthropocentrism. So critics of anthropocentrism argue that it has been used to justify misuse of the environment with little concern for the animals, for the species, for the ecosystem, and the biosphere as a whole. Because man is free to do whatever he wants to do. So that's why the non-anthropocentrism movement came up to challenge that position, that we know man occupied in the Garden of Eden. Human beings have a long and shameful history of environmental exploitation, mismanagement, including pollution, deforestation, destruction of the wilderness, overfishing, and cruelty to animals. So, in his writings, White, in 1967, argues that because anthropocentrism encourages exploitation of the environment, it must be replaced by a nano-anthropocentric ethics to ensure that the environment is adequately protected. And that's the position. So the non-anthropocentrism position holds that non-human biological systems have value in their own right and are not valuable merely as a tool of serving human needs. So many non-anthropocentric scholars hold that human activities such as economic development, agriculture, and industry, they need to be scaled back. Scale back these activities in order to protect the non-human species and the ecosystem and other living things. In fact, one of the scholars, I read his works, and there was a documentary over the BBC, and this gentleman who went up there in the space made a statement and said, if man knew what is happening down here on Earth, he would be worried, because the Earth may not be able to sustain life for a very long time. Now, this is a gentleman who flew up there and looked at the Earth as a small component, right? And discovered that really, given the activities of man on the Earth, this Earth here may not be able to sustain man for a very long time. So the non-anthropocentric thinking is a radical and visionary approach to environmental ethics, because it holds that many of our common sense ideas about the relationship between the human beings and the environment are mistaken. And therefore we need to rethink and come up with theories that relate to environmental ethics. Right, I will not really, again, take too much time defining and taking you through all those things. At least that's a good introductory point, but maybe a few other issues to consider here is that man has not been a good steward of the environment. And therefore, poor environmental stewardship can have a negative impact on human health. In fact, most of the ailments that we are suffering from have been brought up by man himself, right? You know very well the story that is being said about the COVID-19 ailment. Some people think that man was trying to manipulate certain things in the environment, right? The story about HIV/AIDS takes the same kind of perspective, other elements, etc. So man has not been a very good steward, I must say, about the environment. And that's why a new form of environmental ethics must be thought about. So the activities of man on the environment has brought about pollution. It has brought about toxic chemicals that cause human diseases. The actions of man on this planet Earth has caused excessive fishing and hunting, and therefore reducing available food sources. The activities of man on this planet Earth has brought about a destruction of the wilderness, depriving people of areas for recreation and religious and philosophical inspiration. The activities of man has damaged. Those activities of man have damaged the ecosystem, depriving us of clean water and other ecological services. The activities of man have led to the loss of what we call biodiversity, depriving us, people, of economically and medically valuable species, thereby destabilizing the system. The economics of this has had far-reaching consequences on the health and other related aspects of life, psychological, political, etc. The activities of man have exacerbated global warming. The activities of man have caused the misery that we see here. So, many ethical theories, as I said earlier on, including utilitarian, Kantian, natural law, virtue ethics, etc., require us to refrain from engaging in activities that threaten human health and well-being. But we must also be aware of the theory that, that can explain environmental ethics. Right, so having said that, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to talk about the value of human health so that I put into context this element called environmental health. So this thing called health, what is the value of human health? Now I want to say that to make ethical decisions concerning environmental health, if you want to make those ethical decisions, it is important to consider not only the environmental concerns, but to sort out the different human interests and the values such as economic development, freedom, and health. And these are very important issues. And therefore, discussions of environmental ethics would then tend to lump together all human-centered interests and values in framing environmental issues. But there are important differences between these interests, and they have implications for ethical decision-making. So we don't need to destroy the environment, as I've already said. So it's important to say a bit more about health as a distinct human value. Is health a human value which is intrinsic? That is something that we need to understand. Now, traditional ethics and traditional theories, right, they actually say little about human health as a distinct moral value. They say little. For example, Aristotle, right, when you look at the ethics that come from Aristotle's work, right, Aristotle, according to Aristotle, health was necessary for good functioning, but it was not a virtue. Aristotle talks about virtues, but health, to him, is necessary for the good functioning, but not necessarily a virtue. So some of the virtues that were described then included things like promoting good health, right? So he looked at those things that would promote good health, but health was not considered to be a virtue in this case. So Aristotle recognized other important things, and Aristotle recognized health in this case as an important element of happiness. That if you don't have good health, you will not enjoy this element of happiness. And yet happiness is an ultimate aim of every individual. And that's why at the workplace, we must have happiness at work. So, according to Aristotle, poor health could cause pain and suffering. And that's why it's important for us to understand, consider, and develop policies that will promote happiness of employees at work. Now, Immanuel Kant, according to the Kantian ethic of duty, did not also recognize health as a value, but he did acknowledge that people have duties of self-care, self-preservation, self-improvement, etc., etc., which would certainly imply a concern for one's health. Other scholars and other philosophers like Stuart Mill did not view health also as valuable in its own right, though he recognized it as valuable as a means of promoting happiness. Because illness can lead to unhappiness, and yet we want to be happy individuals. Again, when we look at the works of Rao, right, that is justice theory. Health was not his concern. Health was not one of Rao's primary goods. But one could argue that health is essential to obtaining some of these goods, like wealth and income. So we see that all these philosophers, right, underplayed the concept of health. But we know with the development of the World Health Organization and United Nations, this concept of health has been brought to the fore, right? And it is now an important element. Now, when you look at the works of Frankena 1988, Frankena listed health as an intrinsic moral value along with the other values. So it is Frankena who brings this element of health to attention, and he calls health an intrinsic moral value along other values like knowledge, happiness, freedom, virtue, life, and justice, right? And as a result, medical ethicists, right, have taken up this concept of health as an important element that must be promoted at the end of the day. So most theories in medical ethics recognize health as a benefit or good outcome, and they hold that healthcare professionals have a duty to provide this benefit to their patients. So that's what it is. I know. Let me invite you to go and read the works of a Greek physician, Hippocrates, who lived between 460 to 370 BC, who really held that physicians had a duty to benefit their patients and not to harm them, and to take care of the sick and so forth. And of course, if you are going to talk about medical ethics, then of course those elements becomes very, very important. So it's very important for us to consider that aspect. Right. So can we then think about a principle-based method of ethical decision making? Taking ethical decisions is and making ethical decisions is very important because of the conflicts that we have in life. In life, we face many ethical dilemmas, by the way, ethical dilemmas. And whereas it's not my intention to go into detail talking about ethical dilemmas, I just want you to know that ethical dilemmas are real. Let me just give you an example. If, for instance, you are suffering and you are very sick, right? And you think that you love yourself, right? But you are suffering every moment and every hour, etc. You may develop a thinking that maybe there is no use for me to continue suffering, I better take my life. Right? And that's a dilemma, because one would think that A, you want to live. Right? You want to be alive. But two, you are thinking that you should take your life. And that's a dilemma. But somebody says, I want to end my life because I am suffering. Right? And that's a thinking. Right? So, here we have those conflicts among fundamental values. So we have, for instance, we have dilemmas like environmental preservation versus economic development. You want to preserve the environment, but at the same time, you want to develop economically. You want economic development. And if you want economic development, you will not spare the environment. So preservation activities will be very few and limited. The second challenge, property rights versus public goods. That is a dilemma. The third one, promotion of human interest versus protection of animal welfare. You want to protect the animal, but you want to feed on them. Right? You want to eat them. You want to eat the cows. You want to eat including the dogs and the snakes and the rest of it, for those who eat them. And you have a dilemma in that case. Should I preserve or should I eat them? So that's very important. So many moral philosophers in this case, they believe that the key to ethical decision making is to develop a moral theory that will provide a way of ranking conflicting values, rules, and obligations. So that is in as far as we can go, but during your free time, go and read about dilemmas, ethical dilemmas. And maybe in future I may have to come and lead a discussion on that. Right. So let me end my lecture by summarizing the key concepts that we have gone through. Now, in this lecture, we have dealt with ethical issues in environmental health. And we have also attempted to understand the relationship between the value of human health and the value of the environment. In this lecture, we have also attempted to understand that health is an important human value, but it is not the only one. There are so many other human values. In this lecture, we have also attempted to understand that besides human beings, a number of biological systems also have value, including sentient beings, including organisms, including species, including ecosystems, including the biosphere. All these have value too and must be protected. We have also attempted to understand from this lecture that some principles of environmental health ethics include respect of human rights, include utility, and that's from the utilitarian theory of ethics. They include justice, animal welfare, stewardship of biological resources, and sustainability and precaution. And lastly, in this lecture, we have also attempted to understand that ethical decisions should be consistent. They should be fair and reasonable and able to withstand public criticism. Ladies and gentlemen, in our next lecture, we shall attempt to link this concept of environmental health and safety ethics to the nature and the value of individuals at the workplace. And this will lead us to our second topic. So this has been our first topic. Ladies and gentlemen, I must thank you for being attentive. It's not very easy, especially if you have a lengthy lecture like this. It's not very easy to be attentive. I'm told very few people switch off in the first 20 or 15 minutes of their concentration, but you've been very attentive. So we meet again next week with our topic number 2. Stay home, stay safe. I wish you a nice day. Let's meet next week. Bye.